Here we go, Kinesiology 223, Chapter 7, still on feedback, reinforcement, intrinsic motivation. We're in book presentation number 7 for Chapter 7. Speaking about cognitive evaluation theory, and the book also speaks about controlling aspects of reward. This is kind of a beefy presentation. I'm going to have to go through a lot of content in a short amount of time. Obviously, feel free to pause if you need to. All right, here we go. With cognitive evaluation theory, it's a sub-theory of general self-determination theory. So CET is part of SDT, OMG, right? You start getting dizzy from all the abbreviations. But the concept you have is people are inherently motivated to feel connected to others within a social milieu, to function effectively in that milieu, and feel a sense of personal initiative in doing so. A great example of this is when we talk about a social milieu, you have like your social group. You're an athlete and you go to a school to play a sport. And when you're in your sport, you have all your teammates are together in the practice environment, but then you break out from team down into position, or team into defense and offense, or your defensive players will break down further into a particular position. So like I played defensive back in college, we would get together and practice skills as defensive backs. And that would be the social milieu that I was involved in. I was part of that group. That was my tribe. I've used that terminology before. But that was my group. That was where I felt my relatedness was part of my defensive back group. And you'd like to be, as an athlete, you'd like to have the competency and the skill to be able to be effective within that group. If you're not, then you're not going to fit in. You're not going to be a value add. You have an implied value, and then you might have an actual value. But you'd like to have a skill set and the competency to be able to be a value add to that milieu. And then beyond that, you have the ability to function and make decisions on your own and have a certain sense of personal autonomy and the ability to make your own decisions to be able to become better in the context of your social group. Now, as we dig through this chapter, you know, the big things that they come up with, and you got to recognize this from other conversations: effectiveness, relatedness, autonomy. You know, we're talking about, even though they're athletes, it's still a person, and we're talking about sports psychology, and it's how to have this understanding of what makes a person tick, right? And so the self-determination theory has these three basic needs, which we've already talked about: effectiveness, relatedness, and autonomy. And it gives you the hypothesis that any events that affect perceptions of competency and feelings of self-determination will also affect their levels of intrinsic motivation. And I would agree with this, but I would also state that when you start to talk about having this, with down here, it's listed as volition. You have this volitional sense of freedom, and the ability to have your own actions. You have your own agency to have your own actions. What ends up happening is this: you have a bit of a flow through. If I have my own autonomy and the decisions I make affect my behavior and the behavior affects my outcome, I have greater ownership of the outcome. If you have more extrinsic motivators in your life, then the extrinsic motivators create the behavior creates an outcome. Can you truly own that outcome? I would challenge you and say probably not. And that's where intrinsic motivation becomes so key, is because it allows people to have ownership of outcome. And this concept that we're talking about is really a tenuous balance, right? And it's a tenuous balance that really comes with what's called the locus of causality. And that you'll hear like the word locus of control. It's where does that control come from? Where does the causality come from? That's what locus refers to. It's where that reward comes from that kind of matters. And if it's internally or it's intrinsic, it's a conversation of ownership and having the ability to take ownership of the process and ownership of the outcome. And to a certain degree, your athletes will all perceive this process differently. But usually your reward structure and your feedback mechanisms will come from competition, from other athletes in their social group, their milieu, or from the coach, right? I mean, those are the main places where athletes get their feedback from. And so you have to be very skilled at crafting that message to be able to have a reward structure and system in place to be able to lever the things you want and minimize the things you don't. Okay? Now, the other part of this is you have this kind of controlling aspect of rewards. If you have external locus of causality and you're offering external motivation, meaning you have external drivers or a reward system that rewards your athletes, you end up having athletes who no longer feel like they're making their own decisions and they're in charge of their own outcome. But in essence, what they have is they have somebody else controlling them, right? Their locus of control resides, or locus of causality resides outside of themselves. And so really their intrinsic motivation is going to decrease because they're giving nothing but a platter of extrinsic motivators from their coach. And as a coach, you really have to look at it and go, all right, I need to determine what behaviors I want and then offer the appropriate reward structure and reward system to elicit that response out of your athletes. The book lists 6 main ways a coach can undermine intrinsic motivation. You offer tangible rewards like trophies and stuff. You offer T-shirts to your athletes or an ice cream cone after a great practice to your younger athletes. You have feedback that is controlling, that really focuses on the negative components and really doesn't do anything to offer positive feedback. You're trying to always have this kind of virtuous cycle when you're coaching somebody. And if you're constantly browbeating and beating up your athletes, it's a negative feedback loop. Excessive personal control, you are a coach who's very authoritarian in your manner and how you work with your athletes, and you're constantly commanding your athletes to do things and you're constantly telling them to do things. It's never ever collaborative. What you're doing is undermining intrinsic motivation. What you'd love to have is, instead of having this command and control, you'd like to have a little bit of that because you have to manage a practice, but you also like to have some autonomy with your athletes to allow them to work amongst themselves and be able to, within their own group, be able to help each other. Intimidation behaviors, that's just straight up bullying, but you're using the threat of punishment to push athletes to work harder, etc. And we talked about intrinsic, extrinsic, positive, and negative. This example would be file under punishment 100%. Promoting ego involvement. Now, I will tell you, you'll have times where you have to evaluate your athlete's performance, and you might have a time where in the moment your athlete does something exceptional and it becomes a conversation of, all right, did you guys see what Jimmy just did there on that block and that technique? It was absolutely perfect. Jimmy, can you replicate that best you can? Maybe even slow it down 50%. We'll walk through it so everybody else can see the handwork and the hand fighting that you did in that movement pattern. That has happened, and I've used that as a skill. And I've also used this in a coached environment where I've said, okay, Jimmy, it looks like the hand fighting that you used didn't quite work. Where do you think you might have had an issue there? And Jimmy can offer up to the group, and the group then offers back, well, you know what, maybe about this, or use a slap technique or a swim technique, the next time you try that, if he comes at you with his hand position. So it becomes collaborative in nature. And at that point, you're talking about immediately eliminating excessive personal control, intimidation factors, controlling feedback. It becomes a more collaborative environment, and you really get more out of it as an athlete and especially a coach. Conditional regard, I'm sorry I cut that off here, but you can see that in the book. The conditional regard is specific to, gosh, you really let me down. I was really hoping you would have done better. And those are terrible things to say, like in some regard, you have to be honest with your athletes. You can say, hey, I got to tell you, Jimmy, I've seen you play and I know you can do way better than that. Do you want to try again? That's a way different message than saying, wow, you let me down. I can't believe you did it that way. I mean, I would have expected way more out of you. Vastly different. And you'd really want to find ways to minimize that kind of conditional regard voice. So I've talked about it a little bit, and the key you have as an athlete is being able to take kind of like these extrinsic motivators and try to process them and almost like interpret them and process them internally. And if you can get your participants to take some extrinsic motivators and really kind of repackage them and make them intrinsic motivators, well, you got something going as a coach. A great example would be there's a swim record for whatever, 100-yard breaststroke for your school. And that's an extrinsic motivator, right? It's kind of passive. It's on a board. You can see it every day. But what happens is as an athlete, you start to process that and you start to internalize that, like, I'm going to beat that record. And then it becomes not so much about the record, but instead of swimming, a minute 32, you say, I'm going to do a sub minute 30. And it becomes more internally processed. And it's less about the board. And it's more about what you think you can do as you go through the process of your training. So how people process their motivators and their behaviors can really come down to being a huge benefit if you can get your athletes to kind of repurpose and repackage. And what you're really trying to have is have your athletes have this kind of high level of self-determination and perceive that even though it's a number on a board, they've really adopted that and processed that, and it becomes their own internal motivator and their own internal locus of control. And they're using it as a tool to motivate themselves every day. And they no longer have to look at the board. It becomes, I'm doing 129. I'm not doing 132 for my breaststroke. The book does a pretty good job here of kind of wrapping this up in a nice little package. And they talk about how recipients perceive a reward is critical in determining whether the reward will increase or decrease intrinsic motivation. Rewards that people perceive as controlling of their behavior or as suggesting that they're not competent, that'll decrease their intrinsic motivation. And rewards that emphasize the informational aspect and provide positive feedback about competence increases intrinsic motivation. So I would just, in the context of what I read there and over the last couple slides, tell you that one is very process oriented. That's kind of the intrinsic motivation side of it. And the other is, in some regard, outcome oriented, where you have somebody telling you need to do something, somebody telling you need to have a particular outcome. And I would kind of adopt it that way as a coach, though it's not exactly perfect like that. But I would view the ability to have my athletes buy into intrinsic motivation as a process-oriented approach, I think would be your winner as a coach. So cognitive evaluation theory, kind of the informal aspects of rewards, or the informational aspects of rewards. Whoa, getting tired. You want to have rewards in place for your athletes that are extrinsically based, but you have to have athletes who have a very strong internal driver, and that is just as foundational as it gets. And what they try to encapsulate here is you have this acknowledgement structure in place that's an acknowledgement that rewards for outcome or an acknowledgement that rewards for process. Best of practice, most improved, those are different than perhaps a most valuable player award or somebody who had a quantitative amount of most tackles or most this, most that. You kind of look at this and go, okay, what they're trying to get after here is juxtapositioning one being process oriented and one being outcome oriented. And it's an achievement process, but it's also an understanding of rewarding for different things for your athletes. One of the things they outline here is, extrinsic rewards undermine intrinsic motivation if the behavior was contingent upon receiving the award, the reward was expected, and the reward was relatively salient. And I would contest that when you start talking and reading through this paragraph up here, you look at it in terms of how you have what you're trying to control or manipulate behavior-wise, and are you trying to focus on behavior and process, or are you trying to focus on outcome? Those become your two main things. So really it becomes a conversation of this versus this. When you have a situation where rewards or events that provide negative information about competency, those will decrease motivation. And, if you have a critical coach, this will decrease their enjoyment. And this is kind of foundational to what we're talking about in terms of working towards rewards and working towards feedback, but being able to have feedback that's worthwhile. All right, guys, signing off.